down with Judge Ross and I asked him the question, you know, there's that big hotel that Drury built up there in Paso Robles. Has anybody ever really looked at that or researched it and found out where the money came to build that big thing? Now, that's a pretty big hotel. I mean, where'd the money come? We know that Frank and Jesse had come out here, but we don't know where the money came to build that hotel. So that's what started the exploration of the life of Drury Woodson James. Drury Woodson James was born on Whippoorwill Creek in Logan County, Kentucky. He was the son of John M. James, and he was born November 14, 1826. About a year later, his father, who was an esteemed community founder, leader in his community, Kent County and 10 of Lick Skillet, and also a contributor and supporter of educations of ministers and a minister himself, passed away, leaving Drury the youngest child and orphaned. So Drury went to live with his eldest sister, Mary James, and her husband, John Mims. In 1883, however, when they were writing the history of San Luis Obispo County, they interviewed Drury and said, well, who are your parents? Where did you come from? Tell us a little bit about yourself. And Drury at that time identified his father as a Jackson James. Now, we assume that had something to do with his being orphaned. Perhaps the family didn't talk about his family history. We don't know. Perhaps he was mistaken. Perhaps research is wrong. We don't know. But we assume the research is right, and that John M. James was his father, and that probably the most likely thing is that Drury Woodson did not have a big connection to his family in Kentucky, and therefore may have been mistaken. On the other hand, the bottom line is the reporter just got it wrong. Drury Woodson, as I said, grew up with John Mims and his wife Mary James, and they lived on the banks of the Ohio River just outside Louisville in Oldham County in a place called Westport. Later on there would come to be a Westport, Missouri. The same people who founded Westport, Kentucky founded the city of Westport, Missouri. When Drury was a young man, about 16 years old or so, he was enlisted in the 1st Kentucky Volunteers to go to the war with Mexico. There was Judge Oldham there in Oldham County, and he had his son put together a little regiment, the 1st Regiment, Kentucky. And they grouped together a bunch of volunteers. They went down to Louisville. They camped out in the horse race track there, now known as Churchill Downs. And they waited for the barges and boats to come down the river to take them down to New Orleans, down the Ohio River into the Mississippi and down to New Orleans, where they would catch a boat and take them to Brazos Island. From there, from Brazos Island, they would march inland to Mexico into the war with Mexico. There were 10 companies under Colonel Stephen Ormsby, of which Drury's was one of them. And in this war, Drury did not serve in that many battles. The first battle of major engagement that he served in was the Battle of Veracruz. They had to go fight that battle, and when they got there, they found themselves in the company of militia from other states of the Union, and they were surrounded. They were outnumbered in forces by the Mexicans, and they had to defend themselves, and basically what they did was outflank the Mexicans, and they were able to win the Battle of Veracruz. While down there, Drury ran into a lot of people that were known to his community. There was General Zachary Taylor of the Taylor family in Kentucky that were acquaintances and friends of the James family in Kentucky. There was Jefferson Davis, who would later go on to be the first president of the Confederacy. There was Winfield Scott, another old family from colonial Virginia into Kentucky that the James family was well known with. There was Colonel Alexander Donovan, who later would become very prominent in Missouri. There also was Stephen Wallace Kearney, after whom Kearney, where the James farm is in Missouri, would be named. Kearney in Missouri was formerly Centerville. Kearney would also have his name attached to the first fort on the migration trail to the west. There was also Thomas Leonidas Crittenden of the famous Crittenden family. The Governor Crittenden in Kentucky, and later Governor Crittenden of Missouri, who put the price on the tag of Jesse James's head. This is the route they took. After the war with Mexico, in the war with Mexico, Drury Woodson didn't suffer any injuries from battle. However, he did suffer injuries from the march. He had a ligament problem which affected him all his life. Later on through his life, he constantly walked with a cane. And even though it didn't seem to hinder any of his cattle operations during the course of his life, it was an affliction with which he bore for the rest of his life and had a limp and was afflicted by that. And in that time, there was no such compensation for afflictions like that you received in war as there are today. Upon returning home, he knocked around town for a little bit, and then all of a sudden in 1849, the gold rush struck. And the James family started looking at the options in the gold fields. It was at that time that Drury Woodson and his brother William Henry James, a Methodist minister, decided maybe they ought to go out there and see what's going on, and maybe there might be some economic opportunities there to be had. Maybe it's the gold mining, maybe it might be something else. So they set out from St. Joseph, Missouri to what is now Fort Kearny, where they waited about a month or two for the soldiers to arrive and enough of a party to be established for them to make the overland trek west. From there, they followed the typical routes that were first established by Lewis and Clark, and then crossed over the mountains into the Sierra Nevada, where they arrived at a place called Weber Creek. Here are some pictures, very reminiscent of the times. Those cattle those wagon trail ruts you can still be seen throughout that trail today. They are so embedded in the ground, they're still visible. And this is probably a good picture of what the lands were like that they said. It's all virgin territory still, and occupied still by Native Americans. When they arrived on Weber Creek, they arrived in April 26th of 1850. Weber Creek was named after, it later became a town called Weaverville. Weber, Weaver, the name got changed. And it was named after a fellow named Weber, who is a German immigrant, who first set up the first mining camp there, and only to find that a few thousand people followed him to his favorite spots and sort of ruined his business. When Drury Woodson got to the area of Weberville, somewhere along the line he made the decision that maybe gold mining was not the place for he and his brother William Henry. They both decided that perhaps the mercantile possibilities were the same. Coming in the overland route from Missouri, they were coming in with about 6 identified neighbors of theirs from Missouri and Kentucky. They were also coming in with 2 brothers named D.D. Blackburn and James Hanson Blackburn. These Blackburn brothers came from a family in Ohio that was in the cattle raising and meat dressing business. They also established that same business in Henderson County, Illinois, and now they are headed west to do the same thing in California. There's the Blackburns who figured out that there was money to be made in cattle ranching in California. The area was well known for having a lot of bison, free-range cattle, and it was a golden opportunity, and it might be the more prudent opportunity rather than investing all your time and effort in gold mining. So they came over, and they met the Blackburns on their way, and somewhere when they got here, they became convinced that maybe they too ought to go into the cattle raising and cattle ranching business. And it was at that time that Drury Woodson started his business career as a cattleman. He would go from Hangtown down to Santa Clara County. He would buy cattle at $20 a head. He would sell them at about 50 cents a pound on the hook. And then if he had to dress it, he'd sell it for about $1 a pound. And also from Los Angeles, he'd pick up more cattle, drive them north to Hangtown. He'd buy them for about $16 or $20 a head and sell them at $40 a head. So the business was growing. It was a good opportunity. He was making a lot of money. And in 1 year, one cattle rancher made $100,000. And in 1850 money, that was quite a sum to be made. So he made an average of 3 drives a year between Hangtown and Los Angeles, driving about 500 to 700 head of cattle. About 1,500 was the record drove, the high mark of his career, which he drove from Los Angeles, which was then called the City of the Angels. In 1850, a third brother came out on the train, and that was Reverend Robert Salee James, the father of Jesse and Frank James. And shortly after his arrival, it was reported that he died of cholera. Cholera was a very prevalent disease. It was brought here by the Chinese immigrants who were coming east to seek their fortunes, just as the Anglos were coming west to seek theirs. There were also immigrants from Australia coming to seek their fortunes in the gold hills. So everybody was converging on this area. It was a melting pot of cultures, but it was also a melting pot of diseases. And Robert Salee James suffered from that shortly. He probably picked up the cholera actually on his trip, because those guides, those military guides who were going back and forth on the trail, were coming out to California. They might have picked up the cholera. They brought it all the way back into Missouri, because people were dying of cholera there. And then they were picking up the group and then bringing them west again. And as they brought them west, Robert Salee got infected. He's probably suffered the whole trip, but shortly after arrival, he died. Now, when he died, he was buried. And probably the only person or individuals who knew where he was buried would have been his brothers, Drury Woodson and William Henry James. Where he was buried remains a mystery. It's always been suspected that they were buried somewhere in Placerville, Hangtown. Today's name is Placerville, in that vicinity. A few years ago, as I was indicating before our meeting started here, I was notified about this cemetery called Georgetown Cemetery, which is about 40 minutes north of Placerville. And Judge Ross and I went up to visit that cemetery recently. We found the earliest graves, just as had been indicated, 1850, 1851, 52. We found Daniel Craig Boone, a cousin of Judge Ross's, buried there. After we did the research, we didn't know it at the time when we were in the cemetery. So we may suspect that Robert Salee was buried, but it's still unknown. And if it ever is going to be known, it would be Drury Woodson who would hold the secret, along with his brother William Henry. In around 1861, Drury Woodson decided to come into this area. And one of his droves, he stopped here in this area at the Springs to recuperate. Thank you. He stopped here in this area to recuperate. He was still suffering from that leg injury. Those cattle drives were getting to him. He probably had a couple sores on the rump. And so he was getting a little tired of his driving thing. So he was able to cut a deal to buy a 10,000 acre rancho here, which is the one we visited the other day. And he bought it with a partner, John D. Thompson, in a series of 20 real estate transactions that extended into 1861. And he stocked it with 2,500 head of cattle. In 1863, the drought came to the San Joaquin Valley here, and cattle were dying, fortunes were being disseminated, but Drury used his mental acumen. He picked up his cattle, he drove them to Tulare and Buena Vista Lakes. He was able to save his herd. Consequently, he became one of the most wealthy men in the county. So as other people went bankrupt, he was able to pick up their cattle, pick up their property. In September 15th of 1866, Drury James married Louisa Dunn in the wedding ceremony that we reenacted at the mission. And we know about Mary Louise's father, Patrick, don't we? In 1868, there was a visit from Frank and Jesse James. Frank had a bullet hole in his shoulder from a skirmish that he had. Jesse was carrying 2 bullets in his chest. First, Frank came earlier, then Jesse followed. They came through the Isthmus of Panama, both overland through the Isthmus and then up on ships to San Francisco. This is the photograph from the Z. James collection of Jesse James that was signed and dated, found in a stamping ground at Lindsay Farm a couple of years ago. This is the photograph that was found recently in Paso Robles, dated 1868.
There's no date on that one.
Oh,
It has to be there.
It would have been 1868.
Or 69.
Yeah, and Gary will be talking about that later. So this is what he came looking like after he got a little fat meat on him, lounging around town, not making himself conspicuous, so to speak. He put a little weight on. 1869, Drury Woodson purchased a half interest in the Paso Robles Hotel for about $10,000 from the Blackburn brothers. We know a little bit about that history already. Then the town started to grow. We have the two city blocks that were out in this direction, which are the two city blocks out there. The main hotel, Stagecoach, and post office was right here where the hotel where we're standing today. And Drury Woodson had his house 2 blocks down. Now, the house that he built was very curious. This is the house. This is the house from which the trees were taken up to Hearst Castle. And the house was built in the same configuration as the Jesse James house back in Kearney. It was the same floor plan. Very curious. Talk about Drury's public service. In June 1867 to 1869, he was a postmaster. 1869 to 1871, he ran the county. In 1871, he was re-elected to run the county. In 1873, he was elected to the state California legislature, where he carried several resolutions, one denouncing the railroad influence on legislation and elections. He opposed railroad subsidies. He repealed modified tariffs for the pressing governments. And he denounced the China Treaty for opening immigration to an inferior race of people. That's probably an embarrassing thing. Today it would be termed politically incorrect. But at that time, you have to realize that the state was being inundated with a lot of Chinese people. In fact, some areas the Chinese dominated the populations. And the Anglo populations, which were still under the guise of statehood, in the birth of statehood, took offense at that for many years, and there were cultural wars that went on for many years. In the 1870s, he was elected 5 terms as mayor of San Luis Obispo. In May of 76 to 82, re-elected to the County Board of Supervisors again. He was also elected as board trustee and superintendent of schools. And then in 1889, 1891, elected to the California State Legislature, and as a senator, he also was his Democratic Party's candidate for state governor. However, Mary Louisa Dunn, who we all learned yesterday, was a very willful lady and liked to control things, and who was a high-spirited woman, upwardly mobile. She put the kibosh on that. She went to the convention with him and made sure that Drury James was not elected governor. Whoa, indeed. In 1868, 1896, he engaged in stock raising and farming. In 1873, he helped form the Bank of San Luis Obispo. His son-in-law, Edward F. Burns, managed the hotel here. He was also the postmaster. And that individual, Patrick Dunn, ran the Wells Fargo agency. Well, Patrick Dunn proved inept at that. They put him in charge of the Wells Fargo agency. He didn't do that. They made him postmaster. He couldn't do that. He ultimately wound up cleaning the stables. Sorry about that, Patrick. In 1886, the railroad came through the Southern Pacific, and in 1887, the town was incorporated. And Drury Woodson, as Mayor Meacham said, donated the 2 city blocks outside. And in between 1887 and 1892, the town exploded. Drury Woodson James executed over 600 real estate transactions, all of which identified Mary Louisa Dunn on the titles and the mortgages. He never lost sight of her. Then he started to build this wonderful hotel. Here's the old El Paso Los Robles Hotel. Here's the newer hotel going up in the background. The hotel was designed by Jacob Lenzen, who had designed hotels in Monterey and also in San Jose. Resort hotels were becoming the thing. And if you were rich, you wanted to own one because it was going to be the big money maker to come. However, the market got a little overbuilt, and Later on, Drury Woodson suffered a series of foreclosures, which Stanley Stevens will talk about this morning. In August of 1880, Drury sued his mother-in-law to recapture property that she was occupying in San Luis Obispo. Evidently, her husband was not paying on the mortgages and keeping up the taxes. The property was going to be lost, so he sued her. She countersued him for fraud and all the usual things, such as violence, extortion, the typical things that you countersue with a suit. And ultimately, she lost the case. In August 1889 through June of 1891, Drury Woodson sued the partners of D.D. Blackburn, his wife and children, to partition the ownership of the hotel. Subsequent to that, he acquired full ownership of the hotel and proceeded with the development of the Springs Hotel. We've talked about the Springs Hotel. We could skip that. It was a very luxurious and elegant hotel. Many of the town folk accused the people of putting on airs. Drury Woodson's children loved to take their card games out of their homes and now bring them to the hotel, where they, in the ballroom and in the public rooms, they would play games of whist, hold socials, and it became quite the place to be. In 1894, prior to March 1894, D.D. Blackburn and his wife Cecilia sued Drury Woodson James for $60,000 in unrecovered funds. Evidently, they sued him to open up the books. Drury didn't want to open up the books. Drury saw the wiseness of opening up the books, opened up the books, and after the books were opened, everything settled down because apparently nothing was found out of order. But it gives you an insight into the kind of character Drury was. He was kind of driven, he was kind of focused. In 1895, the market for spa resorts collapsed, and so began the collapse of Drury's empire and fortune. In March 30th of 1895, a petition was filed to disincorporate the city of Paso Robles. At that time, Drury Woodson had $49,000 roughly in equity in the town. D.D. Blackburn had about $77,000. The residents had about $300,000 in valuation, and the measure failed. When the measure failed, Drury Woodson moved to San Francisco. He bought a hotel up there, which Mary Louisa Dunn ran. She ran the hotel. He was becoming more of an invalid every day. And in July 1st, 1910, Drury Woodson was in his apartment, in his hotel. The hotel had caught fire. He was saved by a boy in the street who saw the fire and was able to alert him, get him out. He had injuries during that fire. He went into hospital. In hospital, he lingered for about 2-3 days and then passed away. It was wondered what happened to the remains of Drury Woodson James. At first, the family was very secretive about his remains. Nothing was published in the paper except that they were waiting a series of days for his son Edward to arrive from New York City to determine what should be done. In the meantime, we have learned that in that period of time, Drury was cremated. What happened to his ashes, we don't know, but he was cremated. Mary Louisa Dunn was ultimately buried, his wife, in coma. After Drury died, she went on to establish boarding houses for people who were displaced during the San Francisco earthquake. She also worked with the Archdiocese of San Francisco in providing housing for children, orphan children. That may have been Drury's name because he was an orphan. We don't know. But she went on to be a very forthright, strong woman, picking up where he left off and virtually continuing to run the empire, or what was left of Drury Woodson's empire. The hotel burned down in 1846 in a very tragic fire. Since then, the hotel, as we know, has been rebuilt. The town center thrives. People are using it today. You see the legacy, just as Mayor Meacham mentioned, of Drury Woodson's work in setting aside a hotel. So that is your introduction to Drury Woodson James, and I thank you very much.